Today's topic is cover crops and combating weeds in your vegetable garden and your landscape here in Northern Virginia. The agenda, John Krotzer with the Fairfax County Master Gardeners Association is going to talk about cover crops to use in the veggie garden. This is the time we need to be thinking about that in the fall. And then Martha Wilson of our Green Spring Gardens unit will be discussing combating weeds and strategies for that in your landscape garden. Then we'll have some Q&A. I am your Zoom host and moderator, Liz Train with Green Spring Gardens Extension Master Gardeners. And we also have Nancy Miller from the Fairfax County Master Gardeners Association as our Zoom support. So John, I am going to kick it over to you. And
welcome everyone. And again, my name is John Krotzer. I am with the Fairfax County Master Gardeners Association. It's my pleasure to talk today about cover crops. So what are cover crops? This question comes up every once in a while. What they are is they're plants that you grow in the garden whose purpose is to improve the soil's physical structure or fertility. They're the kinds of things that you plant in what you can call the off season. When you're not planting a vegetable in the garden, let's say tomatoes or whatever, when there's not tomatoes growing, you can plant a cover crop, and they do a lot of good things. One is they fill up space and crowd out germination of unwanted weeds. So they can really fill nicely and very tightly the space that will otherwise be used for your vegetable gardening. And very often they're very, very pretty. As you can see on the right, one popular cover crop is crimson clover. So they look much nicer than just bare soil there in the off season. Second is that many of them have very deep roots that can help break up Virginia's very compacted clay soil. They're also, the root structures of some of them are such that they can really do a good job helping to prevent erosion. And they can convert nitrogen in the air into a usable form. It's called nitrogen fixation. They can take nitrogen out of the air, they build it up in their plant material, and then when they're cut down, tilled into the soil or just shoveled into the soil, that nitrogen is available to plants along with other plant nutrients and micronutrients. And that is, for most people, that's the main benefit of cover crops. For these reasons, cover crops are often referred to as green manure. They offer a lot of the same benefits as manure for compost that you'd put in. But these, of course, are ones that you can grow and are pretty, and I can say firsthand smell a little bit better. Next slide. So for fall planting, and you can do cover crops all year long, depending on what you're growing for your vegetables. But since we're focusing today on fall, I'm going to cover just the cover crops that are focused on fall planting. So there's many different kinds of cover crops. They conclude the legumes such as vetch, clover, and peas, grasses such as annual ryegrass, oats, winter wheat, winter rye. And the ones that you use really depend on what you're trying to accomplish. First is what vegetables you will be growing in that spot. And I'm talking in an upcoming slide about why that's important. But the next is, what are your goals of the cover crop? For most people, it's soil fertility. And they want to grow something that they can then till in, and it will really help reinvigorate the soil of the nutrients that are depleted by previous crops. Some people don't want to use it for soil erosion. Some people want to use it for weed suppression. Myself personally, and I'll talk a little bit about my own experience with cover crops in my own home garden. I do it primarily for soil fertility and weed suppression. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through this slide. I just want to highlight that the USDA has a great resource, and I have a link to it at the end of this presentation on your goals, what you're growing, and when to plant it. And they referred to, I don't think anyone else calls them niche 1 and niche 2, but they're the different types. They're like the ones you plant in the fall that will die in the winter, ones you plant in the fall that will live through the winter. There's different uses for them, and I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about that, but I just wanted to highlight this resource as something that's really, really helpful. I know the print's very small, so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these things, but I wanted just to highlight this, and the link is at the end of the slide. So if your goal is for soil fertility, and it's an area where you're going to be planting early spring vegetables. For that, I mean like things like peas, lettuce, etc. The things that you plant, carrots, things that you plant very early in the spring, sometimes before even the last frost. What you want to do is you want to select a cover crop that's going to die over the winter. So it could be any of these ones at the bottom here. Forage radish, Canadian spring peas, mustard, or spring oats. These are things which you'll plant in the fall, from mid-August to around now. You'll plant them. They will grow. They'll bloom, and then when winter comes, they will. Once you get to like -20 or so, minus 25, they will die, and they will sit in your garden through the winter dead. And then as soon as you're ready to work the soil, you can work them in, and they will provide a great deal of usable nitrogen to the early spring plants that you plant. Again, such as like peas, lettuce, carrots, any of that kind of stuff there. Now, for the summer planted vegetables, and these are your things like your tomatoes, your peppers, etc. A more effective way of doing it is getting a cover crop that will survive over the winter, and then it really gets going in the early spring. And that is your winter rye, that's your crimson clover, that's your hairy vetch. I use a combination of hairy vetch and winter rye. You can see winter rye on the right. It just looks a little bit, it doesn't bloom, but it looks a lot like just very thick grass, but it fills every possible spot. It keeps the weeds out. And then when you, in the spring, once you're ready to, or the late spring, when you're ready to plant your tomatoes or your peppers in your garden, you can just mow it down, till it in, and it provides an enormous amount of nitrogen. And again, I'll show you pictures of mine a little bit later. And the planting for that is from around now till the middle of October. So whenever you're taking out your peppers and your tomatoes. So for other purposes, if you have an issue with soil compaction, you can plant, there's a couple different kinds of radishes. There's one called foliage radish, another tillage radish. They're very often used in the agricultural world as well, by farmers for breaking up compacted soil because they have very, very deep tap roots. As you can see on the right, I've got some, they're kind of like those Japanese radishes as well, but they go very deep. They can break it up, and you can grow them very close to one another, so they can really kind of tag team, in lieu of better words, to break up that soil. Another one is if soil erosion is an issue for you, hairy vetch is the one that is the most well known because of its root system and the way it's able to grab hold of the soil. Hairy vetch is a good one, and it also has a very nice purple flower, which I think I will show you if I haven't already. So this is it in my garden. This is just one spot. I do this in many different spots, but I just wanted to kind of show. This was in November of last year. And what we've got on the right, where you don't see any of that grass-like stuff, that's actually radishes that I'm still growing at the time. So that there is just my regular garden. But everything on the left, what looks like grass, that is winter rye. And my purpose there was just for soil fertility. This was somewhat of a new garden. There's a lot of clay underneath there. I added compost as well myself, but I wanted to give it an extra boost after the first year of vegetable planting there. So I planted winter rye, and so there you see it grow. And that's in November. When we got to, it kind of stopped in the winter. It stayed green, but it stopped. And then once we got to the spring, it really took off. And unfortunately, I don't have a photo of this, but you know, I have a little electric mower that I have. So I literally went in there with a lawnmower, cut it down, let it sit for a while, and then I tilled it in. and I had a great year. I'm throwing okra away. I have okra in that middle spot. I'm throwing it away. I cannot keep up with it. It's really, really taken off versus the previous year when it was my first year growing okra and it didn't have as much luck. Likewise, I had cucumbers on one side of that and zucchini on the other, and had a good year this year for both. So how you use them, I alluded a little bit to this already, but in order to prepare your cover crop bed, so if you're going to want to remove the plant material that's there. So for example, in my tomato area, clear out the tomatoes, which is normally good gardening practice anyways, but clear it all out, any debris and large stones, rake the area smooth, and then I just hand toss the seeds on there. If they're big seeds, I might rake it again just to make sure that there's good soil contact. And the seed packet will these are seeds that are primarily focused on cover crop. So the instructions on them will be focused on what to do for cover crop. So follow the instruction there. In general, for things like peas, if you're using certain kinds of peas for it, you will plant them much closer than you would planting regular peas during the, if you like sweet peas or snap peas, because you want them to be close for the weed suppression impact. If you've planted one of the ones that dies over the winter, you don't have to do any, If you've planted one that's died over the winter, you don't have to do anything special. Just in the spring, you can just till it into the soil. It will have begun breaking down during the winter. If it's one that is winter hardy, like the winter rye that I used myself and that I showed in the earlier picture, you're going to want to cut it to the ground about 3 weeks before tilling. That gives it time for the plant to die. The actual stuff you're cutting down, the cover crop, will start to decompose a little bit, and then you can till it in or just shovel it in then. And what that does is that makes sure that that it's dead and it can begin the process of decomposing. One of the things that I've not had an issue with, but in doing the research for this presentation, I've learned a lot about, is that if you don't do that, a lot of times that plant can live and it can go on and it goes to seed, and it actually can become a problematic plant for you. You'll end up getting hairy vetch or crimson clover or whatever all over the place. So you're going to want to cut it in the spring before it has a chance to go to seed, let it fall, give it a few weeks to die off, and then till it in. It makes, by doing that, the tilling is very, very easy, and it ensures it will not grow back.
Hey, John, there's a question. Where do you buy tillage radishes?
I normally go, a lot of my seeds I get on Etsy. So, but if you search for tillage radish, I think, your Burpee will have it. I don't use tillage radish, so I'm not quite sure, but normally I will get my seeds on Etsy. Ever since COVID, I've been trying to support more of these small farmers that have these seed operations. So that's where I would look first.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And
Thanks.
I'd be very cautious about getting them from somewhere like an Amazon, because you buy this in bulk. It's a big enough quantity that you'll find a lot of people trying to kind of hawk them on Amazon. You don't know if they're coming from overseas or not,
Right.
or what you're planting, or if they've been treated with anything.
Yeah, John, another good source that I found was Johnny's Seeds, but I didn't know if the radishes are planted by seed or if you actually are planting a radish, more of a plant to start.
No, these ones are by seed, and I've seen some of the ones, because if you had to do them individually, it would take you forever to cover all the area. But so the ones that I've seen when I was doing research for this, they were in seed packages. But of course, for some kinds of radishes, you can buy them as little, I forgot what they call them, like plugs almost, but you can do them individually for ones that you eat. But these ones are all seeds.
And John, is there any difference in methodology in terms of the planting and tilling or selection of your cover crops between raised beds and in-ground beds?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I have never looked at it differently. I use it in both. I'm obviously I'm not doing them all in containers, but I haven't seen anything which suggests that there's a difference between the two. Sometimes it's probably a little bit harder to get in with a mower into a raised bed. I know that was a little harder for me.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
So, and then some last notes I wanted to mention, and this is one thing I do as well. Many gardeners will use mixes of cover crops to get multiple benefits. They'll have foraging radish for the soil compaction and crimson clover mixed in for the nitrogen. I mix in, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it, but from all the places except the one I had the photo of, I mix in hairy vetch as well. It's got a really, really nice purple flower, and that has been, and I actually let it continue to grow on one side. I have an area that I could keep under control, and I got all my seeds for this year just from that one plant. So a lot of people mix them up, and if you look up cover crops, often the ones that are for sale, they will already have a mix in there. And as long as that mix meets the goals of what you want to accomplish with a cover crop, those can be very, very nice. And then I wanted to just once again repeat that I focus this presentation on the fall planted cover crops, but you can also plant other kinds of cover crops depending on what you are growing. So for example, I have a small part of my garden that this year for the first time I'm doing Brussels sprouts. Well, they're going to be going well until November or so here. If I didn't use that area, actually I used that area for peas earlier, regular snap peas, and since they're a good cover crop by themselves, once I was done with the peas, I just tilled them, cut them down, let them die, and then tilled those in. So that was kind of a summer cover crop for me. But there are other ones you can do, and the resources I have on the next slide have a lot of information on year-round cover crops. So that is it, if anyone has any additional questions.
Thanks, John. That was really thorough.
Can I ask one question?
Please.
I'm curious, if you plant the carrots, and I mean carrots, radishes, could you plant them over your perennial bed and just pull them up? Would that help loosen the soil? Or do they have
radish,
to be tilted?
you could definitely, I think you could definitely do that. The thing is that normally they plant them very, very close to in proximity to one another, so it really covers everything. But I think you could do that for something that has a very deep taproot. And as you know from the presentations that we've seen from Bree Arthur, who's spending a lot of time mixing the landscape plants and the edibles. She plants turnips and those kinds of things within the landscape vegetables, and I believe she's cited that what that can do for soil compaction is one of the reasons she chooses to do that. So I think could be done. And to the earlier point, I know you were looking for the word, but I think carrots could be also used in that same way, because depending on the type of carrot, many of them do have a very deep taproot.
All right, that's your last slide. I'm going to stop sharing.
I think like many of us at this time of the year, we're weary. We've been combating weeds all season. And so it's a good time to sort of look at various strategies and try to review what we've done that works and what we could maybe do different for next year. And in doing some research on this, I came up with what I call 3 approaches, but there may be more, but I have them sort of in these 3 buckets. And the first is the classic mulching that we're all familiar with, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that first up to say, well, why do we still do that? The second one is where is what has been somewhat new to me, planting densely with companion plants. And then the third thing we'll look at, John just alluded to Bree Arthur, who talks about interplanting in your landscape with vegetables and fruits. And the purpose is not only to feed yourself, but because it actually combats weeds. So we'll touch lightly on that at the end. So in starting with sort of the first one that a lot of us know well, and that is your classic mulching, where we take between 2 to 4 inches of hardwood or pine or leaf mulch. And you spread that in and around your plants, your shrubs, and that's going to help combat your weeds. You can underlay that with 2 to 4 layers of newspaper. Or if you're starting an entirely new bed, you can do what's called sheet mulching, and you put cardboard down, and then you add your organics on top of that. And what you're doing there is you're depriving the weeds of both light and nitrogen. That's why that works. And then the plants that are already existing, their roots are usually deep enough that that surface nitrogen that gets used up in the decomposition process does not hurt what is existing. So this is the classic mulching that we all do. And hopefully, as both master gardeners, but for those who are tuning in, there are other benefits. You know, why do we do this in addition to combating weeds? Mulching does a lot of really good things for our gardens. It absorbs rainfall. The rain that comes down, sometimes as we've seen with our global warming, the rain can come down really hard. So it absorbs the rainfall. It slows the runoff so that you don't get the soil that is beaten by the rain itself and then just runs off of your beds and down your driveway. It slows it, it absorbs it, so therefore it's helping with the erosion control. And then there's a lasting benefit even after the rain itself. Because it's absorbed the rainfall, it's creating this moist blanket between the soil and the sun. So your mulch is going to slow your evaporation, which actually cools the roots. We're getting more and more and more of these 90+ degree days. And so you want to keep your roots, even for plants that like full sun, you often want your roots to be kept cooler than that. So it helps to do that. And it keeps that soil both moist and soft. If you've ever seen your parts of your yard, which in these really hot days, really dry days, it cracks. It almost looks like somewhere out in the far west. That's because the evaporation has happened at such a deep level that your soil is actually hanging on to itself and cracking. So mulching prevents all that. So lots of good reasons to mulch. However, if you've been at this for a while, there is a flip side to mulching. And a lot of us have noticed this as the more diligently that we mulch, we find that after a few years, the mulch itself has done, on the one hand, a very good job. It has decomposed. It's now releasing the nitrogen and nutrients back into the soil. And that's a definite win if we're dealing with hard and compacted or Virginia clay type soil. But you'll notice the more mulch you have used, this nutrient-rich soil, it's not only good for you in your plants, it's good for the weeds. And I asked a question myself this year, is why do the weeds win? Well, the weeds win for a couple of reasons. They're aggressive. They often germinate faster, they flower faster, and then they often produce an overabundance of seed. And that seed gets thrown and it embeds itself in your soil itself, and it's called the seed bank of weeds. And so you're often having to do more weeding if you don't keep up with that mulching very diligently. You're doing more weeding, even though your soil texture is improving, lots of things are improving, your weed situation often is not. So what next? Well, you all may have seen that this book by Thomas Rainier and Claudia West. Much to my joy, these folks are local. They're in Alexandria, both landscape design, horticulturists. They're becoming quite popular, particularly with this book. It's called Planting in a Post-Wild World. The gist of the book, and it can be read, I think, at many levels. It is both a technical manual. You can go through and find your recommendations, some of which we're going to go through in a minute. What can we put down to plant densely to help combat weeds? But then it also can be led as to what are beautiful plant combinations that can bring us joy in terms of landscape planting design. So I highly recommend it. There's a concept though that I think is key that they're presenting. And instead of using their particular version of this, I found this other wonderful slide. It's from a mysmartgarden.org website, showing the concept that Claudia West and Thomas Rainier are advocating. And we think that if you're planting densely, then there's going to be so much competition that the plants that you want to grow aren't going to grow well besides these other plants that you're introducing. And their research has found that that may not be so if you plant smartly. The makeup of the plant ecosystem is as complex underground as it is above ground. Some plants have extremely deep taproots, as John was just mentioning. Other plants have a very wide spread of roots. So they're often using the nutrients at completely different levels in your soil makeup, in your soil slice there. So they're not really competing with one another. The other thing that we can remember is that different plants use soil nutrients differently. Some, like the nitrogen fixing plants that John was talking about for the vegetable garden, work equally well in your landscape because they're adding, as they go through the winter and they die back, their very roots and their leaves that are on top of the soil are adding nitrogen back into the soil. So planting densely, if you get the right combination of plants, actually is a way to combat your weeds and improve your soil nutrients all at the same time. Because what you're doing, of course, is shading out those weeds that you don't want. So the question becomes, which plants, what plants, how? And what I did for this presentation, the next number of slides, is I wanted to really focus on that ground cover layer. In my case, I live inside the Beltway, and I have a lot of old established plants, both that I have put here, but by previous owners. And yet, I don't want the grass trying to run up straight to these plants because that's neither good for the plants, nor is it very interesting. So I thought, let me focus on ground covers in the various growing elements that I need and what works. And are there natives that can fill some of these niches that I would like to fill? And the answer to all of these questions is yes, there are natives and they can grow in various growing conditions. So we've got a couple. The first growing condition I wanted to focus on is the shady areas where you've got mature, either trees or shrubs. Sometimes it's very hard to get a grass to even get established under there. So stop fighting it. Don't put the grass there. One recommendation is this barren strawberry, GM Varganoides. It only grows 3 to 6 inches high. It has a beautiful leaf. Yes, it is related to the strawberry. Your birds will usually, and your other mammals will eat the fruit off of this, any that comes up, but it's largely barren. You're growing it for the dense pack. This is not your stoloniferous weedy strawberry. This is a particular one that grows nice and dense and is a beautiful ground cover in and of itself. Wild ginger, Asarum canadensis, beautiful ground cover for your most dense shade. Heart-shaped leaves, native plant. The ants are what pollinate it. Put some in and it will begin to spread. A couple more that are in your dense shade that works, or dense shade to part shade. A lot of folks have begun to learn about our green and gold. It's a Virginia native, beautiful gold flowers in the beginning of the season, and then lovely foliage throughout the season. One of my favorites that I planted this past year is my Woodland Flocks. You get beautiful, when it says 18 inches, that's for the beautiful flowers that come up just like a stem in these heathery blue shades in the early spring, this Phlox divericata. But after that, it is this beautiful layered medium to dark green ground cover that stays nice and tidy, but is dense enough to keep out your weeds. It's a really good choice. It can take some morning sun or some dappled sun, but it's a good one for your shady spots. A couple more that I'm really learning to love. Pachysandra was one of the, I guess, standbys for years and years and years. People had Pachysandra. But what you probably have in your garden, if you inherited it, is Pachysandra terminalis, which is an Asian variety. And it's not native. It doesn't nearly have the same benefit for our native birds and our native pollinators. Try this one. It is not fully native to this area, but it is native to our Allegheny, our slightly further northern areas. So it will be more beneficial to our pollinators here. It's called Pachycentric Procurements. Beautiful spotted foliage. Its bloom is also in the early spring, but it comes off the side, not off the terminal ends. And this one is, I think this guy is magic, because Pachycentric Procurements can go in your most shady areas, a little bit dappled sun. It's going to get a beautiful russet color in the fall, and then it dies back in winter. Why is that a good idea? You can underplant this with your spring ephemerals. So you can get your Virginia native ephemerals that bloom, and they'll come up through this. Then as it's dying back, as those things, your ephemerals die back, your bulbs, if you just like your daffodils, your other sorts of regular bulbs, this guy will then cover over that, and you've got this beautiful ground cover the rest of the time. Your sedges, your Pennsylvania sedge is a good one, and that is a Virginia native. And your Michaela repens, or your partridge berry. This doesn't usually grow quite dense enough to completely combat weeds, but it's a really low grower. So if you've got shrubs that you want to plant under, the berries will feed our pollinators and our Virginia birds and other mammals. So I'm looking forward to trying that one this coming fall. As we move to part to full sun and medium soil moisture, I found a whole list, and I've got a few pictures that are coming up. But I wanted to first give this list in case people are snapping a picture, because we really can plant and interplant densely with this variety of ground covers that will go with your more formal shrubs or your other perennials in your yard. So let's explore a few of these. New favorite of mine, this dwarf crested iris, Iris cristada. Tiny little guy, 6 to 9 inches, beautiful blue iris. It's native, but then these are going to die back in the spring like most irises do. And yet it creates this almost grass-like sharp texture that will cover in and under shrubs. You can even put it with perennials that get taller, because it's a part sun. So it's going to do its whole blooming cycle before some of your later perennials. It's a wonderful one to mix in with some of your larger perennials. And then it will be back in the spring before they get going. So that's a great option. This robin's plantain or fleabane, Erogenus pulcinellus. Again, it's only taller when it's blooming. It's going to be more of a spring to early summer bloomer. And then it's going to go back to this lovely ground cover, creates nice dense mats. It's one of your American Beauty natives. I have this one in my garden, this tick seed, this mouse-eared Coreopsis. A little different than some of the tick seed, which comes out later in the season. This is a spring bloomer, and when it's done, it just gets these beautiful little lobed, dense mats. So this is a great edge border. If you've got things that you feel like you've got your later perennials or your shrubs, and yet you're constantly pulling weeds on the edge, plant the stick seed as your first, I guess, your first act in the spring, and then it becomes a green border for things that are taller behind it. This blue-eyed grass, and I'm not going to try it, it's his Latin name, but Augustifolium. Looking forward to trying this guy. Can't beat this beautiful blue spring flower. It's actually in the lily family. It looks like a grass, but it's not a sedge. It's in the lily family. So a little bit higher on this one. It could be right at the edge or slightly back in your border. And then for me, this is one of the next categories that I think is really important. What do we do during the midsummer into the fall? Our spring stuff is gone, but now the weeds are really going gangbusters. I have just planted this dwarf Heath Aster, Symphotricium Eracroides, really low, 3 to 6 inches, very much a ground cover. This is something that I'm planting in my sunniest, most areas, again, as a weed combater, because I want this to come in. It's going to give me a fall show, not a spring show. And then it's called snow flurry because it grows so densely, blooms so densely that it actually is going to largely cover even its own green needle-like leaves on it. So I've just introduced this into my own garden and I'm already very pleased with its spread. A couple that I don't have pictures of, the purple poppy mallow or wine cups, a little bit looser, and it's more native to central US, but a beautiful, beautiful bloomer, can be used as a ground cover. And then lastly, our Sedum stone crop, that's kind of a stalwart that can be used in your most sunny and dry spots if you're trying to combat your weeds. And then we move to lastly, the area that John had mentioned, Brie Arthur. A lot of us heard her presentation from the Smithsonian, and I immediately ran out and got her book. She's using fruit and vegetables, in a sense, as ground covers because the leaves are large, interspersed amongst her shrubs, amongst her perennials, because then you're getting both fruit as well as ground covers. A lot to explore there, and rather than you could do a whole presentation and she gives them, but I just wanted to mention that is another way to combat weeds with fruits and vegetables. Here we have edible landscapes in your garden. This pen live, they really are quite beautiful. They're quite showy. You can add, and look at the size of the Swiss chard that we have here. So it acts as both weed cover as well as a vegetable that you can eat. So whatever approach you use, whether you're using your traditional mulching, your companion planting, or your interplanting with vegetables, the idea is that we're lowering our maintenance burden and enjoying both the beauty and the bounty of our garden. And that's all I have.